Welcome to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast. I am Jason Mann, and with me today is a very special guest. He is the author of the book Thinking Basketball, a contributor at Nylon Calculus, and does some wonderful work at his own website, backpicks.com. Ben Taylor, welcome to the show.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. And we asked you to join us for a special series that we're kind of kicking off where we bring in NBA writers and other podcasters to share something memorable that helped shape your NBA fandom. And, you didn't really have one thing that stood out, so we sort of, narrowed down your choice based on a series of options and ended up with a game that we had been wanting to talk to about for quite a while. It is the double overtime classic from March of 1992, the Celtics beating the Blazers 152-148, a game that was on national television on NBC back when that was a big deal.
Spoilers.
Yes. Yeah, I am spoiling here. That's something that we do on occasion on this on the show. And for you, what made this game stand out? What made this game special for you?
We didn't have one game. We were emailing back and forth. I could have gone about 7,000 words deep on a Fab Five tournament game or something like that. But yeah, we got to this Portland-Boston game, which I think was like this seminal. It's the double buzzer beater. I think that's what it is. At that age and just growing up and still playing a lot of sports, there was something about the buzzer beater itself that was extremely captivating to me. And I only think I realized that after that game where there were not one, but two. Larry Bird hit one at the end of overtime. And then Kevin Gamble hit another one, or it's descended to overtime. And then Gamble hit one to send it to double overtime. So, and come on, there were 300 points scored in the game.
Yes, and I actually looked this up. There are only 20 games in Basketball Reference's database where both teams scored more than 148 points in a game, and only 3 games have occurred after this one. So that's a fairly noteworthy occurrence in NBA history. I'm not sure if Basketball Reference's database is complete in this regard, but still, that's that would be a large majority of them for sure.
Yeah, no, it was a rarity. It was a treat.
Absolutely. And yeah, to kind of set the scene here a little bit, the Blazers at the time, 46-18, coming into the game, they had been to the finals in 1990, 91. They were still a stout team, but they were upset by the Lakers, another stout team in the playoffs that year. I guess it was an upset. Either way, it was they were among the elite teams here. 92 again at that point, they had the second best record in the NBA at the time. They ended the season second in the league in SRS behind the Bulls. So they were obviously the Bulls were on another plane, but the Blazers were there. There was certainly not it was not unbelievable to think that they could compete and maybe beat them in the finals. They were led, of course, by Clyde Drexler, one of the greats at the time, kind of under heralded in my mind sometimes. Terry Porter and Jerome Kersey, also excellent players. Also notable there, you got Buck Williams, Kevin Duckworth, Danny Ainge, of course, facing off against his old team. Clifford Robinson. Yes. Well, I think I put them in the order in which they were listed in the box score, perhaps. So I guess that's why he was there. But Mark Bryant and young Robert Packett. Cliff Robertson also once dragged us on Twitter, so we put him down on the list for that reason.
He's well known for dragging. I think Uncle Spliffy is his new handle.
It is.
I'm not sure if people know that side of his business life now, but
yeah, he's into he's in the marijuana sales business. Hey, hurrah for him. Yeah, we enjoy Clifford Robinson despite dragging us on Twitter. We're okay with it. It happens. These are things. Yes,
we're getting sidetracked.
Right, it's going to happen here on the podcast. It's just something that happens here. Mark Bryant, young Robert Pack. What do you kind of remember about the Blazers from this time? I think of them as a little bit among the more unheralded teams in NBA history. They accomplished a lot. Obviously, they fell to a great Bad Boys team in '90 and fell to a great Bulls team coming in 1992. Spoiler alert again. What stands out to you about them?
Well, I think you're right. I think there are a collection of teams, especially probably since the 70s, the last 4 decades and change, that have had these little spurts, 3, 4, 5-year runs, and they don't win a title. And then they kind of they fade to a certain degree. History becomes very polarizing, and it's like the haves and the have-nots. But they were a really good team. They started to get really good at the end of the 80s. Very, very athletic. They also gave me, like, we should bring this up. I grew up in Boston, but I loved a lot of different teams. Portland was like my team in the early 90s. So I had rooting confusion that day where it's like you're kind of rooting for the Celtics because you live in the city and the people, my dad is a big Celtics fan and we're watching the game together, but you also want Portland to do really well. It's like, make sure you do well, but don't win kind of thing. Anyway, they were very athletic, very exciting. And I had an irrational, like, basketball crush on Terry Porter. I don't know why.
Yeah, well, he was a fun guy to watch. I mean, it's understandable that you would have that crush. He was entertaining. I mean, Drexler particularly, to me, I mean, in addition to being a great player, just was aesthetically pleasing to watch. I mean, just an incredible dunker, just, flew all over the court, was, could just get to the basket with a head of steam and, do nifty moves around the rim. And he's, I think, maybe the number one guy who, like, the shadow of Jordan, like, casts it maybe the most greatly over Drexler because, to a certain degree, they're such similar players and they played, obviously roughly during the same career. And obviously he doesn't measure up to Jordan, but, he's one of the probably, top 30-ish players of all time and just, because of playing exactly the same time as Jordan, gets a little bit sidetracked. Probably playing in Portland most of his career didn't help either. Portland doesn't get the attention that some other markets get. If he played in Boston for his career, for example, probably that would give him a little bit of a boost there in remembrance.
And a perfect nickname to capture that aesthetic. The glide. It would kind of, to put it in modern terms for people less familiar with his game, it would be like if James Harden were like the flop or something. No, I kid. James Harden's great. The whole team was great. I think Drexler was, to your last point, I think he was unfairly put in Jordan's shadow, almost like a real life straw man. Like, just give Michael an adversary that he could knock down. And I think a lot of that was manufactured in some way. I don't think Drexler wanted that, nor was it his personality, nor was it even his style, right, as a player. They had fairly different styles, even though they played the same position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Meanwhile, the Celtics, still with Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and Robert Parrish as their most notable players. Well, along with Reggie Lewis, who had emerged as a star at this point, and was probably the best player on this team. Although Bird, when he was healthy, was still very effective. McHale was still pretty good, but those guys were in their mid to late 30s at this point. Bird and McHale nearing the end of their careers. Parrish would still hang on for a few more years, despite being the oldest of the three. At this point, in the season, they were tied for 10th in the league in record. They ended the season 8th in SRS. So still a pretty good to very good team, but obviously not really a championship contender unless you squint very hard. Other guys who were on the team were notable: Kevin Gamble, Dee Brown, John Bagley, Ed Pinckney, and a very young Rick Fox, who does play a key role in a couple positions in this game.
What's interesting? Bird was in and out of the lineup with his back that year, and they were actually far better with him in. It wasn't like they were sort of a fledgling team. When he played, I think his passing, his spacing, his shooting, he still had that, even though he kind of tippy-toed around the court at that point in time. And he seemingly unlocked something in that team that made them more viable. Like when you sent me the record at that point, I was actually kind of surprised that they were so far behind a team like Portland when was that game? February?
March, yeah.
Yeah. So they were better than you would think when they had all hands on deck, which wasn't too often in the regular season, and then potentially another spoiler, an Achilles heel in the playoffs as they kind of fizzled out in the same way.
Yeah, well, yeah, and as the season went on, in the playoffs, he did not play effectively. Part of that, only played 4 of the 7 games in the playoffs, and that was basically the end of his career. Obviously, except for the 1992 Dream Team, that he obviously was a better note to go out on than than those playoffs were. But this is, really probably the last, well, almost certainly it's the last great, all-time classic game from Larry Bird. 49 points on 62 true shooting, 14 rebounds, 12 assists, 4 steals in 54 minutes, which is actually a career high in minutes, amazingly enough, at 35 years old.
Can we run that back? Because I've known that stat line for a long time, but
sure.
This is 35-year-old Larry Bird on his last legs in 1992 against the best team in the West. It was 49 points, 14 boards, 12 assists.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not too shabby.
No,
4
not too bad. Yeah. Yeah. And, it was just really far and away his most points scored that year. He had 32 against Orlando early on that year. It's the 7th best game score in basketball references game score of his career, which may not include all of his pre-83 games. It includes at least some of them, but maybe not all of them, but still, up there in the greatest games of his career, according to that metric. And according to, just watching it and seeing how he produced, it's certainly up there. It's just a remarkable performance, obviously for a lot of reasons. An important game for them. They were on a losing streak. They're battling for division lead and for, a stronger playoff spot. Obviously they're pretty far away from the Bulls at this point, but they're still, I'm sure they're harboring ambitions of making one last run with, all these old guys. So, a great performance, an all-time performance really from Bird the last time he had the opportunity to do that. But as far as the Celtics go, obviously you were a fan of theirs, being in Boston. What stands out to you about this team, kind of at this stage of the Bird-McHale-Parish Celtics?
Well, they felt old. And in your recap just now, I was thinking of how old they actually were. It was sort of like, you have this peak period in the 80s, and then they didn't think of the Spurs, right? The Spurs have, at least before they lost Kawhi, they had recharged to some degree. They've turned players over, and they've brought in fresh blood. And I think that was just always missing. Len Bias died, of course. Reggie Lewis, I think, was the promise for that. Obviously we know what happened to him. So it was like, it was hard. It wasn't like a team where you're like, we're super psyched because they have this incredible, Lakers 2017 collection of young players or anything like that. It was a weird mix of like very old guys and a couple candidates to Rick Fox, people were very excited about when he came in, which is kind of strange in retrospect, but yeah, it was a strange team. It was, I guess, the classic, like, 50-win team.
Yeah, exactly. And, there were guys, like Ed Pickney was a guy who had a lot of promise coming out of college and was a bit of a disappointment in the NBA. D. Brown was, obviously got stardom from the dunk contest, and there was some hope that he could emerge as a solid star for them, and was never really that effective for them. Yeah, they just didn't have. Yeah, I mean, their success kind of caught up to them to a certain point because they weren't really able to replenish that much. Obviously, Len Bias passing away was a huge blow because he would have been very likely been an elite player that could have helped sustain them as a contender for longer. And obviously Bird's injuries. He was. It's amazing how effective he was given the pain that he was dealing with, and that he lasted as long as he did. Given all of that, but those obviously added up. I think one interesting thing, and I think it's shown to a degree in this game, is that the Celtics were still a fast breaking team. A lot of what they were doing was based on the fast break. They were a running team. They were not afraid to push the pace. And this game has a lot of pushing the pace from both teams. I remember from Unfinished Business, the Jack McCallum book about the 91 team. So, obviously similar to this era, and, Bird talking about there was a emphasis again put on, them reestablishing the running game, even though they were an old team. It felt like the mentality that he had was that lazy teams don't run, and, teams that are working hard do run, which I kind of, basketball went away from that mindset, I think, for a long time where if you're a fast breaking team, you're not playing defense. If you're a running team, you're not playing defense. That the game kind of got slowed down and bogged down. And obviously that's kind of turned around in the recent years with how the Warriors play and the pace going up over the last 5-6 years or so. It's just kind of interesting how those ideas kind of cycle and how the styles kind of cycle.
Well, if you could recapture the way that the 60s Celtics played, you would recapture their success. And a lot of that was based on this idea of you're running and distributing the ball in offense and you're getting out in transition. And, the thing my dad used to say constantly was they had 6 guys in double figures. They had 6 guys in double figures. Like it was almost fetishized. Like get as many guys in double figures as you can. So I think the great segue in the lesson is that no one really knew for a very long time that the 60s Celtics weren't particularly efficient on offense.
Sure.
Which is not to say, of course, that transition and running isn't effective at times, but it was just that basic for a long time. And the coaching tree that was there was often disciples of like the old guys. And Tommy Heinsohn coached the team in the 70s and then moved about 7 feet from the coach's box to the broadcast booth and yelled the same tropes still to this day over and over. I really wanted to pick a game to look back on where Tommy Heinsohn cursed someone out on TV, but
we can use our imaginations.
Yeah. So, but I think that's where that came from a lot. And look, I can't hold it in. We got to get to the end of this game. The end of this game is, I think, really what made it tantalizing for me and kind of one of these seminal moments. Here's what I remember, and I think you just rewatched this so you can check my memory. The Celtics were down in such a way at the end of the game that it looked like it was over. They were down by like 5 with 15 seconds left or something like that. I turned the game off. I left in a stew. In a competitive fit of childhoodness, I ran down the hallway or something, and I said, "That game is over. I don't need to watch this." Is that right? There was the end of the game it looked like it was put away.
Yes, and in fact, Portland was up 5 with 12 seconds left. And they talk about later on, Marv Albert and Mike Fratello talk about how actually the crowd began to empty in the fourth quarter, but then they returned once the Celtics tied it happened. They returned during the overtime, which is, of course, great, a capsule of the times that you could, do that back then. But yes, so Bird is able to basically somehow, kind of outquicks everyone, is able to get a quick layup. And then Kersey is fouled, misses 2 free throw and commits a lane violation to give Boston the ball back.
Right. With a couple seconds left, if I recall correctly.
Yes.
Yeah. And then, so that's when my dad called me. He called me back on Kersey's second free throw. So I run back in the room, and how much time was on the clock when they had that dead ball?
Around 3 to 4 seconds. I don't have the note here exactly, but something in that ballpark.
Yeah. And then they throw it into Bird, who hits this like quote unquote 3-pointer where I always felt it was a very old school referee situation where he was kind of maybe fouled and they could have given him an and one on a long 2, but they just called it a 3. And I'm pretty sure his right foot was on the line, but it's the old days. So it's a 3.
Yeah, there's no replay. The good old days when games were not bogged down by endless replay. That's what I like. No, yeah, he basically, he like sort of like jumps, and right before he lands, he is able to get the ball off. It's kind of like a jumps off of 1 foot and lands off the second. It's a very, very difficult off balance 3 that he's able to get with Drexler right on his hip, and it goes in. And the crowd gets a little excited. They're pretty happy.
It was the peak of athleticism, that move.
Yes.
I think he jumped about 7 inches off the ground, and his shot was this crazy line drive that had no business going in and went in.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
That was crazy. And then they went into overtime, and I think they were down 2 in overtime, and not some incredible comeback like at the end of regulation, but Kevin Gamble drilled a shot at the buzzer to send it into double overtime.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, there's like Bird basically misses 2 straight threes that would have given Boston the lead, including one where he was wide open. He got his feet set. Then the the Blazers were up 2 with about 30 seconds left. Drexler missed a running hook, but then Buck Williams got a offensive rebound, was fouled, but then he missed both free throws when Bagley drives in and gets a pass to Gamble, who gets about an 18-foot jumper, and it swishes as time expires. It is definitely a shot that would have been he would have of course been behind the line and gone for 3 today. It's just, you get so used to that it's almost funny to see somebody not spot up for the corner 3, but was able to get the tie. Another dramatic shot, obviously another big crowd reaction.
Oh, he lived off that shot. He made an NBA living off of the 16-foot pull-up.
Sure.
And there were a handful of guys that kind of had that specialty at the time. He didn't really have much else going, but that shot was money. Mm-hmm. He drilled it regularly, and I even remember when he took it at the time, I felt pretty good that we were going to a second overtime. I was like, oh, okay, this is a pretty good shot.
Yeah. It was a good play. It was a good drive by Bagley. It was pretty much right on the money. So, Bird was. I'm not like forcing it, because he was. He definitely. I think he had 43 at the end of the fourth, and then only 6 points into overtime. So he was effective in other ways, but definitely his shot kind of left him during the overtimes.
I don't believe you, but okay.
Okay.
I don't remember Bird ever missing. So
Sure. One thing I'll say that was noticeable about Bird here is that, he is obviously so good at so many things, just an incredible passer, incredible, basically all of the aspects of the game, incredible shooter, but his ability to get off shots in tight spaces was really, on note here. And I'm sure was a skill that served him well as, he dealt with his back issues. This is the athleticism, never his, primary skill, declined even more. But he really was able to just get it in those very, very tight windows and that's something, not just him, a lot of great players obviously have that ability as well. And that's an important part of, being an incredible shot maker, but it really stands out in this game.
Well, I think that's a good note to speak to how overrated athleticism can be sometimes, whether it's Bird in the 80s or Dirk Nowitzki recently, or even someone like Steve Nash, like the ability to do things on the court, shoot with skill, pass, have vision, make good decisions, use your body. Now, one of the techniques you see Kyle Lowry does it really well in Toronto is this: put your guy in jail, just get somebody on your back and kind of use your hips and your space. All of that stuff can give you a toolkit to attack that doesn't require, you don't have to jump over people constantly and dunk on a whole team to be effective. And I think with Bird, he was so skilled in those areas, he was able to maintain a pretty strong offensive impact at the end of his career. The athleticism sort of killed his defense. He could rebound because he stayed near the hoop, but his movement and his rotations were slow. And those are the things that suffer. But you can still be a phenomenal offensive basketball player even today without being a spectacular athlete.
Sure. Yeah. And just having, that vision that sometimes that the distinction between athleticism and skill. There's all kinds of different ways to play and be successful, and obviously different players have found, with higher levels of athleticism and lower levels of athleticism have found success just through, intelligence and through vision and know-how and all that good stuff. So getting into the second overtime, not quite as dramatic, although it does get pretty exciting there toward the end. Do you recall the last couple possessions of this game?
No, okay. I do not. Did something weird happen?
It gets a little weird because it looks like the Celtics are about to take it. They Bird has a couple of highlight plays. He starts a shot, but then sees Bagley cutting and dumps the ball down to him for a layup. And then later on, Bird's final make gives Boston a 6-point lead with about 2 minutes left. And they keep that lead, pretty much through, a 6 to 8 point lead until about 40 seconds left. There's a lot of free throw trading for a bit. Bird steals a Mark Bryant offensive rebound to help them. But then Drexler is able to get off of a 3-3. He gets a quick drive and feeds it to Williams quickly for a 2. Then Bird has an awesome outlet pass from the baseline, basically under the basket, to a wide open Rick Fox who had just gotten into the game, who gets a wide open dunk.
Was that on a make?
That was on a make, yes.
Yes, he was one of the better players ever at taking the ball out of the net and just knowing what outlet was available. So he's catching and turning and throwing these passes instantly.
Right.
Just incredible.
Yeah. And then the Blazers respond. Danny Ainge immediately hits a 3-pointer over Pickney to cut it to 3. Then Fox gets a free throw to put it back to 4. Drexler gets a good pass to another Blazer. I couldn't make out who it was on a jumper to cut it to 2. And then Drexler at that point fouls out on Boston's possession and then gets a standing ovation from the Boston crowd. And he had a great game as well. He had 41 points on 60 true shooting, 8 rebounds, 11 assists, and contributed a lot as well. Had some pretty ambitious 3-pointers, some pretty far distance ones especially for the time there. So, and then at that point, there's a couple of free throws, which make it go back to a 4-point lead from Gamble. Then Danny Ainge has this weird play where he gets stuck in a corner. He dribbles out of it and then goes back to the 3-point line, draws a foul, which is only 2 shots at that point. The rule hadn't changed yet. So he hits the first, but then misses the second. And at that point, it's basically over. Pickney gets a free throw. And Portland tries to get a Ainge 3, but they're down by 4 at that point, and it misses, and that's it. So it got a little bit exciting toward the end. Some interesting stuff, going on there. Obviously not as dramatic as the end of the fourth and end of the first overtime.
Yeah, no, that was a fun. I was replaying that in my head as you ran that down. No, it was an incredible game.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So one thing I want to talk about is some of the stuff that you were working on, that you are working on, that you might be working on in the future. And first, we've talked about it on the show. I think most people on the show are probably familiar with the series, but for those who aren't, you did a series looking at the 40 greatest NBA players in history, and I think it's just an incredible blend of scouting, of taking analytics and making it understandable and understanding the context, and also looking back at history and understanding historical context. It's kind of a mix of biographical observations of skills, all the looking at number, impact, all great stuff that you did. Can you tell people just a little bit about the series and the work that you put into it?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for those words. It was very kind. When I'm feeling down, I know who to call now to get a pick me up. It was many years in the making. I started really getting into historical stuff and historical statistics almost a decade ago. And over on Real GM, they would run these historical projects. I think that's really what sort of burst the dam open for me. I'd kind of had some interest on my own, but in these projects, you go all the way back in time. So the first one I was exposed to looked at every NBA season retroactively all the way back to like the beginning of the shot clock. And we'd go through each season, we'd rank the players, we'd read articles, we'd look at trends, we'd look at the stuff that happened. And that was 2010. And then so over the years, I just worked on a lot of historical stuff, and I had kind of thought or had an inclination to do something like this at some point, and the time was right, and I did not realize what I got myself into. So it was a long time to put together. It was like a year-long project. So yeah, and I really wanted to use video and more context, and I think that's what kind of got the snowball rolling down the hill, if you will. I started watching some old YouTube games and grabbing clips, and everything went from there.
Yeah. I mean, even just going through the profiles and just watching the videos is fun. And usually they're just, shorter clips that just kind of give context to the play, and Ben kind of demonstrates, his point using the clip, and, and he's watched, hundreds of clips for all of these guys, and just, and really just digs deep into, what made the player special, their skills, their flaws, how it kind of evolved over their career. And, just like I said, it's some really great stuff. I mean, this project, ranking players can always be a little bit problematic. But I think that, the best attempts at this are really just trying to, get a deeper understanding of, of the game overall and of what, of what can be valuable and more just about what was good about these players and also the difference between, of course, kind of the reputation versus the reality of it. And, and for a lot of these players, particularly the pre-90s players, that's so useful because these guys haven't been examined in that way, in a long time, if ever.
Right. And I think the sort of further back you go and the less data you had at the time that shaped the narrative, the more opportunity you have for a narrative change. That was certainly what happened with me over the years with Wilt. I was growing up, I liked numbers and I had little encyclopedias with all the history and the record books and things like that. And I was like, wow, this guy averaged 50.4 points per game in a season. Actually 50.36. I lost a trivia game once because you weren't allowed to go over. And I confidently stamped down 50.4. And they took it out to 2 decimals. So 50.36 points per game in a season and all these other records he had. But if you the further back in time you go in the game, right, all of those narratives back then were shaped by they didn't have any concept of efficiency. They didn't have any concept of really team level metrics. They had a very basic box score. If you can find old box scores from the 50s and 60s, they would have your free throws made, your free throws attempted, and then your field goals. They were like, the number of field goals you attempt doesn't even matter.
I know. That's incredible. That completely obviously different mindset of than we have today. But the emphasis of the free throws over the field goals is kind of hilarious in retrospect. Yeah.
So I think over the years I had collected more and more information about the past. One of the big projects I did, which is up on Basketball Reference, Neil Payne ended up extending it and putting it up on Basketball References, team efficiency ratings before 1974. So that kind of opened your eyes to start seeing things like, well, wait a second, the Celtics offense wasn't really good, but their defense was incredible. Or like, wait a second, Wilt scored 50 points a game, but the team's offense was like the same the year before. It didn't really seem to move the needle or budge anything. So starting to collect this information over time, which still I think is kind of in the shadows even today on the internet, and trying to bring that out into one accessible place. That was really one of the goals I had in mind.
Are there any players that you really changed your thinking on significantly after you kind of did the research and work, in this series?
Well, I think if you go back to the beginning where I started, certainly Reggie Miller is someone who's just slowly moved up more and more the more I've studied him over the years. Even in that vein, like someone like Patrick Ewing, who I think his 90s reputation, at that time, he's kind of, he's not in the Olajuwon Robinson group of centers. He's not on Jordan's level. He's in a big market, but kind of chastised for a lot of failures. And he just wasn't a guy that I had thought about as like, maybe you think of him as like a top 50 guy, made the all NBA at 50 team, but he certainly moved up over the years to me, both because of the importance of defense and the ability of, his defense itself, but also, his offensive game peaked kind of before the Knicks did. And so that happens a lot of times. Guys get unrecognized or they get a narrative spun about them that is a little unfair if your peak or your skill set kind of peaks when the team isn't at its peak. Mm-hmm. So those are two guys from the 90s. I think in general, the big winners over the years, and I talk about this in Thinking Basketball, guys who are hurt by this so-called winning bias, this idea that when you win, what our mind likes to do is go back and give a tremendous amount of credit to the winning players on the winning team. We kind of throw away, I use this idea of like an antiseptic wash or something. We wipe clean all of the mistakes someone did, and we hold on to the great plays. We do the exact opposite for a losing team. So if you have a guy like Hakeem Olajuwon or Kevin Garnett, who was saddled in these mediocre situations at best, the franchises and the management, weren't great or consistent, and the teammates weren't fantastic over the years, and you just get these stretches in their prime where they play, looking back on some of the rosters is a little cringeworthy. Those guys tend to get left behind. So I think Hakeem and Garnett in that sense. And then the other one is the scorers, like Wilt, even Elgin Baylor at the time, Moses Malone, Bill Russell. I used to be lower on because of this emphasis on scoring. And I think, in fact, when you look at how valuable defense can actually be, when you look at how relatively valuable passing or shot creation can be, it kind of starts to change players who rely heavily on scoring, even if they're moderately efficient, right? The first movement was like the anti-Allen Iverson movement. Well, efficiency matters, so he can't be that great. It's more complicated than that. But then the sort of after effect of that was like, okay, well, if you're a big scorer and you're still efficient, then you must be fantastic. Ergo, Adrian Dantley is the GOAT.
Sure. So what was there a ranking that you felt like you got the most feedback or criticism from, and was it Kobe Bryant?
Man, I was nervous about Kobe because he can actually, first of all, watching him can be spectacularly fun. And then dissecting his game really should be like exciting and instructional in different ways. But of course, the conversation is super polarizing. I don't think I got the most feedback. I was probably Jordan and LeBron just because of where those guys stand. Yeah, I mean, obviously with Kobe, you have the ranking issue, but to me, the actual positions were secondary to the analytical takeaways about each guy's game.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
For the record, Kobe's 14th, which I think is valid, and it's a great read, as they all are. Yeah, I think the ones that surprised me a little bit the most, Drexler's at 39, which is just I kind of considered him more in the realm of the top 30. Although you obviously make really good arguments for Drexler, and I think your profile, Reggie Miller, was probably my favorite one, or kind of made me think the most in terms of the way that his offensive skills, obviously in terms of his shooting, but also in terms of his movement, being able to kind of shift the defense to create attempts for other players. Like that was a concept that I hadn't thought quite as much about. I think traditionally the skills, he didn't have the kind of, taking your man off the dribble kind of skills that we associate with a lot of the great shooting guards, and his, box score numbers are very good, but not necessarily, elite type things. But I thought you made a really interesting case about how, the way that he played actually creates, an incredible amount of value, maybe even more than, some of the traditional shooting guards that we kind of think of, with the off the dribble type skills. Well,
I think the great irony is we have this almost like this street ball rubric where if you're really good at one-on-one, or, you have a skill set that allows you to take your man off the dribble or in the pinch post or something like that we give you a tremendous amount of credit. I think there was a video going around recently, the Team USA camps that they're having right now, and everyone was playing the one-on-one throw-in games. And it's like they throw the ball into a guy in wherever he is inside the arc, and he takes 4, 5, 6, 7 seconds to make his move. And if he hits a jumper, he wins and stays in. And it's like, that's very limiting. That's a tremendous skill. But if you had a team of those guys, you'd kind of be stuck. And in real life, it's really not very effective to hold the ball and dribble and hold the ball and dribble and up fake and hold the ball. And so when growing up, Miller was penalized to me because he didn't do that, which I think is backwards. He was penalized because he made quick decisions and he could come off screens and be effective off the ball. And to something that you said, he would even pull players out of the paint or draw extra defensive attention. And you pair a guy like that with a good passing point guard. So when Mark Jackson got there, it's like, okay, now you have to be careful, because when you run your floppy pin downs and he comes off those screens, don't leave the screeners or they're going to get layups. And Antonio and Dale Davis had a half a living getting a bunch of dunks like that. And so there's more with Reggie, right? And I go into it in the piece. His playoff performance is unnaturally improved compared to his regular season. His team's offenses were always very good. He just stacks up really well, and his scoring volume and efficiency are like they're almost off the charts. They every public and private scoring evaluation metric I've ever seen treats him as one of the better scorers ever, and that was not the reputation he had at the time. He grew up in this Jordan era. Drexler was another perfect example. And if you weren't a shooting guard who averaged 5 or 6 rebounds a game, 5 or 6 assists a game, then here, wait for it, you were demonized as one-dimensional. Right? That was what he was labeled growing up, one-dimensional.
Yeah.
And if you reread Bill Simmons' entry on him, which I did after I published the Miller profile, I went back and read it. I mean, he just, or I think right before because I have a footnote about it, he just rails on him as this one-dimensional, like 18 3-and-3 player, as if all players who average 23-3 or something in the regular season are the same. So.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the playoff, success that he had, the unnatural playoff success that he had, because without actually really deeply examining the case, you could think of Reggie as a guy who had 3 or 4 big playoff moments that mostly came against the Knicks or high profile teams, so they're kind of outsized in public imagination. So you could almost imagine him being overrated because of that. Like a
right.
Robert Horry type thing or whatever. A thing, but yeah, it actually the funny thing is that he really stands out in terms of being one of the few players who really step it up in the playoffs consistently, and where you have enough evidence to show that he was a player who was even more effective in, or didn't lose his effectiveness in the playoffs like many players do.
Well, I think the other thing that was kind of lost at the time, speaking of the dark ages of analytics or data, the Knicks teams in 93 and 94 were 2 of the greatest defensive teams ever. And most guys, including Michael Jordan, when they went up against them, their numbers go down. Scoring gets harder because they're in a harder scoring environment. You get fouled on every play. So what's interesting about Miller is he has all these moments against great defenses. And there's something that seems to be sort of impregnable about his attack. And theoretically, I think it's because he uses screens so much. Mm-hmm. And we see this even today with Steph Curry, where you'll see there was some Matt Moore had some thread, I think today or yesterday, talking about how Curry still gets so many open catch and shoot opportunities. Well, you use screens well, and you kind of have to pick your poison. If you can't guard everybody 30 feet away from the hoop when they have 2 giants, setting semi-moving screens for him all the time. Yeah, I use the term semi loosely there.
Right, exactly. So you've also been doing some work recently, sort of looking at passer rating, kind of looking at some of the flaws in how we evaluate passers, or some of the traditional thinking, and trying to or maybe re-examine it a little bit, and maybe addressing some of the flaws in how we evaluated passers of the year. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing with that?
Yeah. Well, I think it started from a place of us not really doing much to evaluate passers in the first place, right? I think really throughout history there was this concept of the assist, and the assist was viewed as an acceptable proxy for all things passing, right? But I think the first thing for me that started years ago was noticing the difference between guys who racked up assists and guys who created open shots for teammates. And so that was the first sort of path I went down. And then more recently, I've been, trying to think about passing more holistically, right? I think at some point I got to have a passing manifesto that I publish or something. But think about it. It's we tend to sort of lionize guys who make fancy passes or behind the back passes or no look or head turning passes. And those are plenty valuable. But passing is this area of the game that not only is super impactful, but think about all the things that go into passing. I've been trying to make a list, right? It's like you can have on-ball passing, which is when you're dribbling and sort of in control of the possession. And then let's say you drive down the lane. Well, you got your drive and kick pass, right? You got your drive and lay down pass. Kobe was fantastic at that, FYI. You've got skip passes. LeBron, probably the best skip passer I've ever seen. You got pick and roll pocket passes, right? Chris Paul does that really well. Nash was probably the king of that. Then you've got this pick and roll lob pass. You've got, how about outlet passing? We were talking about Bird earlier, right? Magic in transition. Which side do you go to? How long do you wait? And all of those things. And then there's off ball, like extra passing and, passing on the run in the lane. So all of these kinds of reads add up, and you look at each one of those sort of dimensions of passing and you say, okay, how efficient are you? Are you making elite high leverage finds that other people can't find? Are you making good finds that some people could find but are moving the ball to the right area to make the defense more vulnerable? And then how many turnovers? How many times do you miss? How many times do you take chances you shouldn't take? You wrap that whole thing up and you get passing.
Yeah. I mean,
simple enough.
Right. I mean, I think the thing that has kept it from being studied more is that there's so much that goes into it. There's so much that goes to evaluating a passer. It's just easy to look at assists and say, hey, he has more assists.
To be the best passer, it probably means to add the most value across a generic circumstance via your passing, right? I think that would be a fair kind of high-level definition.
Sure.
But I don't think a lot of people are going to give me pushback about the things I just said. But if you think about it, we don't really have a definition within the community of like what makes someone a better passer. And historically, people just kind of gravitate toward the highlight level passers. Or assist to turnover is another one, right?
Sure.
Still coming from assists, but someone decided, if we just look at turnovers in this ratio, we can also say, boy, Chris Paul has a 4-to-1 assist to turnover ratio. Ergo, he must be the point god. He's not too shabby. Chris Paul, Jason. Chris Paul was a guy I got a lot of feedback on. And I think what people don't realize is I often get feedback from both sides, which is a very weird experience. So you'll publish something and you'll get a group of people saying, how on earth can you have Chris Paul in the top 25? He's never even made it out of the whatever.
Right.
And he's injured all the time, blah, blah, blah. And then you'll have 20 minutes later, how on earth do you not have Chris Paul in the top 20? I mean, he's one of the greatest point guards. It's a riot. Yeah, it's pretty funny.
That's good. Yeah, he is kind of a divisive one. Yeah, we don't need to get into it, obviously, but the Isaiah Thomas versus Chris Paul thing, which is definitely a Twitter battle that I feel like happens every summer, although I don't recall seeing it quite this summer. So maybe we're past that one. I don't know. But I'm it's been an exciting series so far. And definitely I very much agree that it's a subject worth study. And you've been studying all these really interesting things. So I commend you for making the attempt. And at least one more thing I want to quickly talk about is your book, Thinking Basketball, which I recently went on a trip to Europe and read as I was traveling. And it's fantastic. I mean, it's just, it's very thoughtful but very accessible. It's a excellent read. It's a good complement with your your regular blog writing, especially the Greatest of All Time series. It's really good stuff. So I don't know if you want to plug the book at all beyond that, but it's really good stuff. People should definitely check it out.
No, I appreciate that. You can get it on Amazon, and I think the only plug that I'll make is that I think in my mind, it's a companion reading to that Greatest Players of All Time series. Mm-hmm. In a sense, it's a prerequisite because it lays more theoretical foundational elements that I pick up on in the series. And I think it also would help explain to folks who have different ranking philosophies why I chose to kind of have this, slightly different but very structured approach to how I ended up ranking players in the series. Yeah.
So, anything else before we go?
I am planning on launching a podcast. I think that's worth announcing. I started up a Patreon for that, and you can support me on, I think it's on my website. If you go to backpicks.com, you'll see a link there to my Patreon. The Patreon itself is Thinking Basketball.
Yeah. We'll include it in the show notes as well. So for anyone who's looking for it.
Cool. Awesome. And the idea, we were talking about this before we started recording today. The idea is that basically I have had free time challenges over the years with being able to create basketball content. It's my second job, if you will, my nights and weekends work. So the ability to have people come in and support and help me produce more content is sort of this driver for a next chapter, which is a podcast. No idea what I'm going to talk about. I think I'm going to talk about basketball.
Probably
yeah. We could start there.
Okay.
I don't know where it's going to meander into.
Sure. Well, I sometimes wonder where we're going to meander into in this show. So it's, I think it's common in the podcast world. A lot of times we delve into wrestling for whatever reason. So, but no need to do that today. But
professional wrestling or Olympic wrestling?
Professional wrestling, of course. The sport of kings.
Oh man. I don't know where to go from there. We meandered. Yeah. We definitely meandered today.
We meandered a little bit. But anyway, Ben, thank you so much for being on the show. This was a pleasure, of course. Check out Ben's Greatest of All Time series. Check out his book. Support him on Patreon if you dig what he does, which I bet you will. And thanks for listening to us. Of course, you can find us at thestepback@fansided.com. If you want to leave a rating and review on iTunes, that would be awesome. We're also on Stitcher. We're on we're basically on every platform in which you listen to podcasts. So if you want to rate and review us someplace else besides iTunes, go ahead. We would love that. And we're on Facebook and Twitter at Over and Back NBA. So thanks for listening, and we'll be back again soon.